The chamber fell silent as every HFY warrior stared at their leader, waiting to understand what the human had whispered that could produce such a reaction. The leader, whose name was Vorath, had commanded this syndicate for 15 years and had never shown weakness to anyone, and now he stood frozen while a bleeding human woman waited calmly for his response. "How do you know these things?" Vorath finally asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I know your name," Yuna said loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I know the name of your home colony on Keth Prime. And I know the names of your 3 children who still live there. And I know the location of the dwelling where your mate waits for you to return." The warriors around them shifted uneasily, because this was information that Vorath had kept secret from everyone, and information that could be used as a weapon. "If I die here tonight," Yuna continued, "that information goes to Thresk the Collector. And you know what Thresk does to the families of his enemies. And you know that he will not show mercy to your children simply because they are young. You would threaten innocence." Vorath demanded, and there was outrage in his voice. "I would not," Yuna said. "And that is exactly my point. And I do not want to hurt anyone who does not need to be hurt. And I especially do not want to hurt children who have done nothing wrong." She gestured to Vala, who was watching this exchange with wide, frightened eyes. "She is a child too," Yuna said, "and she has done nothing wrong. And you took her and hurt her to use as leverage against her father. And I am offering you something different." "What are you offering?" Vorath asked. "A way out where everyone lives," Yuna said. "And you let me walk out of here with Vala, and I destroy the information about your family. And your warriors survive, and your syndicate survives, and your children never have to know that their father's enemies had their names." The other HFY warriors were watching this exchange with expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief, because this was not how conflicts were resolved in their culture. In their culture, you fought until one side was dead, and the concept of mutual survival was almost impossible to comprehend. "You could have fought to the death," Vorath said slowly, as if working through a puzzle that did not make sense. "And humans are supposed to be weak, but you defeated 6 of my warriors without killing any of them. And now, instead of using your advantage to destroy us, you offer us a path to walk away." "Yes," Yuna said. "Why?" Vorath asked, and this time the question was not a challenge, but a genuine attempt to understand. Yuna thought about the question for a moment before answering, because it deserved a real answer. "Because I know what it is like to almost lose everything," she said. "And my species has spent thousands of years fighting each other over territory and resources and beliefs. And we have come very close to destroying ourselves more times than I can count. And what we learned from all that suffering is that the greatest victory is the one where nobody has to die." She looked around at the warriors surrounding her and met each of their eyes in turn. "I do not hate you," Yuna continued, "and I do not even hate the warriors I fought tonight. And I understand that you are doing what you believe is right for your people. And I am asking you to understand that I am doing the same for mine." Vorath stood silent for a long moment, and Yuna could see him wrestling with concepts that contradicted everything he had been taught about strength and honor and victory. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Take the girl and go," Vorath said. His warriors erupted in protest and shouted that this was weakness and dishonor, and that they should kill the human and be done with it. Vorath silenced them with a look. "She fought 6 of us and won," he said. "And she had every reason to kill them but chose not to. And she has information that could destroy my family but offered to destroy it instead. And if that is weakness, then perhaps we need to reconsider what strength really means." Yuna helped Vala to her feet, and they walked toward the door, and not a single HFY moved to stop them. At the threshold, Vorath called out to her one final time. "Human," he said, "why do your people fight so hard only to show mercy at the end? And how can you break yourselves apart protecting others, and then offer your enemies a way to walk away?" Yuna turned back to face him. because we know what it costs to lose someone you love," she said, "and we would not wish that pain on anyone else. And mercy is not the absence of strength, but the highest expression of it." She walked out of the compound with Vela leaning on her shoulder, and neither of them looked back 3 hours. Later, Una sat in Thresk's chambers, watching the crime lord embrace his daughter with a tenderness that seemed impossible for someone so dangerous. "You have earned your payment," Thresk said when he finally released Vila, "and your colleague will be released immediately, and transport will be arranged to any destination you choose." "There is one more thing," Una said, "and the Cathari compound contains precursor technology that could destabilize the entire sector if it falls into the wrong hands. That is not my concern." Thresk said, "It should be," Una replied, "because I have already sent an anonymous report to the Alliance about the technology's location, and they will be sending a recovery team within the week, and the Cathari Syndicate will be too busy dealing with that investigation to cause you any more problems." Thresk's compound eyes focused on her with new respect. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. "I planned for multiple outcomes," Una admitted, "because that is what humans do." The next morning, Una and Sorix boarded a transport heading for Alliance space and watched through the windows as Nexus 7 grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. "What really happened in that compound?" Sorix asked. "And what did you whisper to the Cathari leader that changed everything?" Una smiled but did not answer. Some secrets were worth keeping. What she did not tell Sorix was that she had been bluffing the entire time and that she had no information about Varath's family, and that she had simply guessed that a warrior leader would have people he loved and named a colony that any Cathari might call home. The bluff had worked because Varath wanted it to work, and because somewhere inside the fearsome warrior was someone who was tired of death and violence and who welcomed an excuse to choose a different path. That was the thing about mercy. Una thought as the transport jumped to faster than light speed. It gave people permission to be better than their circumstances required them to be, across Nexus 7 recordings of the human who had fought barehanded and won with a whisper spread through underground networks and were copied and shared until they reached every corner of the station. The recordings showed a small human woman standing against impossible odds and refusing to give up and choosing to spare her enemies when she could have killed them. The galaxy had seen humans before and had dismissed them as soft and weak and unimportant. Now the galaxy was beginning to understand something different. Humans were not just persistent predators who could chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Humans were the species that would break themselves apart to protect others. Humans were the species that would offer their enemies a chance to walk away, and that combination of relentless determination and unexpected mercy was perhaps the most terrifying thing the galaxy had ever seen, because you could prepare for an enemy who wanted to destroy you. But how do you prepare for an enemy who wants everyone to survive, including you? The maintenance corridors of Nexus 7 were dark and narrow and filled with the constant humming of machinery that kept the station alive, and Una moved through them like a ghost, following the map she had memorized from Thresk's holographic display. She reached the outer ring after 2 hours of careful navigation and found the access point to the Cathari compound, exactly where the map had indicated it would be. The hatch was old and rusted, and clearly had not been opened in years, which confirmed what Thresk had told her about the Cathari, considering these passages beneath their notice. Una slipped through the hatch and found herself in a storage room filled with crates of mining equipment that had been abandoned when the Cathari converted this facility into their stronghold. She paused and listened, and heard nothing except the distant sound of voices speaking a language her translator implant identified as Cathari Standard. Moving carefully from shadow to shadow, she made her way through the first level of the compound and saw her first Cathari warrior standing guard at an intersection ahead. He was massive, with 4 arms crossed over his chest and eyes that glowed faintly red in the dim lighting, and every line of his body radiated the promise of violence. Yuna waited until he turned away and then moved past the intersection so quickly that she was gone before he could have seen anything. Even if he had been looking directly at her, the second level was more challenging because there were more guards and they were more alert, and twice Yuna had to press herself into alcoves and hold her breath while HFY patrols passed within arm's reach. She reached the stairs to the 3rd level and found them blocked by a guard who was not going to move and could not be avoided. Yuna approached from behind using every skill she had learned in years of military training and struck him at the base of his skull, where the neural cluster was vulnerable. The HFY collapsed without a sound, and Yuna caught his body and lowered it gently to the ground. She had been trained to kill silently, but she chose not to kill because killing would escalate this situation, and she was badly outnumbered, and escalation would mean death. The 3rd level was different from the others, with better lighting and cleaner floors, and the unmistakable feel of a place where important things happened. Yuna found the detention cell within minutes, and Vela was exactly where the intelligence had indicated she would be. A young Morvith huddled in the corner of a small room with fear in her compound eyes. The cell door was secured with a simple mechanical lock rather than an electronic one, which made sense because the HFY would not want their prisoner to be accidentally released by a system malfunction. Yuna picked the lock in 30 seconds and stepped into the cell. "My name is Yuna," she said softly, "and your father sent me to bring you home." Vela looked up at her with disbelief, and then relief, and then fear again. "You are human," Vela said, "and how can a human rescue me from this place?" "We can discuss that later," Yuna said, "and right now we need to move." She helped Vela to her feet and saw that the young Morvith was injured with dark bruises visible on her carapace and one of her arms hanging at an awkward angle. Anger flared in Yuna's chest because there was no reason to hurt a hostage, and hurting someone who could not fight back was the act of a coward. "Can you walk?" Yuna asked. "I think so," Vela said. They made it halfway back to the maintenance hatch before everything went wrong. A patrol appeared around a corner directly ahead of them, and the HFY warriors saw them instantly and raised weapons and shouted alarms that echoed through the entire compound. Yuna grabbed Vela and ran. She did not know where she was going anymore because the route back was blocked, and all she could do was move and hope to find another way out. They burst through a door and found themselves in a large chamber filled with strange machinery that hummed with energy and pulsed with lights that seemed to shift through colors that human eyes were not meant to see. This was it. Yuna realized this was the precursor communication array that Sorix had warned her about, and standing between her and the only other exit were 6 HFY warriors with weapons drawn and murder in their glowing red eyes. "Put down the hostage," the lead warrior commanded, "and perhaps we will make your death quick." Yuna placed herself between Vela and the warriors and raised her fists. The HFY laughed because what else could they do when a tiny unarmed human stood against 6 of their finest warriors? The first warrior attacked, and Yuna dodged his blow and struck him in the throat, and he fell gasping. The second and third attacked together, and Yuna took hits that would leave bruises for weeks, but she kept moving and kept striking, and when they fell she was still standing. The fourth warrior was smarter and hung back and let the fifth and sixth attack from opposite sides, and Yuna could not avoid both of them, and she took a blow to the ribs that cracked bone, and a blow to the head that made the world spin. But she did not go down. She fought through the pain, and took out the fifth warrior with an elbow strike to the temple, and the sixth warrior with a knee to the groin that proved HFY were vulnerable. In the same places as humans, the fourth warrior stared at her with something that might have been fear. "What are you?" he demanded. "Someone who does not give up." Yuna replied she beat him too, but it cost her. It cost her blood and pain, and she could barely stand when the door behind the fallen warriors opened and more Cathari poured into the chamber. A dozen of them now surrounded her and Vela, and there was no way Yuna could fight them all. The wounds from the arena had not fully healed, and the new wounds from this fight were draining what little strength she had left, but she raised her fists anyway. Because that was who she was, the lead. Cathari of this new group stepped forward, and he was older than the others with scars covering his body and the bearing of someone who commanded respect. "You killed 6 of my warriors," he said. "They are unconscious," Yuna corrected, "and not dead. And I do not kill unless I have no other choice." The Cathari leader studied her with his glowing eyes, and she could see that he was trying to understand and made no sense to him. "Why?" he asked. "And why would you spare enemies who would not spare you?" Yuna lowered her fists because fighting was not going to save her now. Instead, she stepped closer to the Cathari leader, and she leaned in and she whispered something in his ear. The words were too quiet for anyone else to hear, but the effect was immediate. The Cathari leader went rigid, and his red eyes widened, and when he stepped back from Yuna, there was an expression on his face that none of his warriors had ever seen before: uncertainty. The private chambers of Thresk, the Collector, occupied the highest level of Nexus 7, and the windows looked out on the endless stars that surrounded the station. Like scattered diamonds on black velvet, Yuna stood in the center of a room filled with artifacts from 100 different worlds, and tried not to show how much pain she was in from the fight she had just survived. Thresk was Morvith, like his assistant, but older and larger, with patches of gray spreading across his dark carapace, and eyes that held the patient cunning of someone who had survived decades in the criminal underworld. "You are wondering why I brought you here," Thresk said, and his voice was surprisingly soft for someone so powerful. "I am wondering many things," Yuna replied, "but mostly I am wondering where my colleague Sorix is being held, and what it will take to get him released." Thresk made a clicking sound that might have been approval, direct and practical. He said, "And those are qualities I value highly, so I will be direct with you in return." He gestured toward a holographic display that activated in the center of the room and showed the image of a young Morvith female with delicate features and frightened eyes. "This is my daughter Vela," Thresk said, and for just a moment something that looked like genuine emotion flickered across his alien face. "And she was taken 3 days ago by the Cathari Syndicate as leverage in a business dispute." "A business dispute?" Yuna repeated. "I control the weapons trade in this sector," Thresk explained, "and the Cathari want that trade for themselves. And they believe that threatening my daughter will convince me to surrender my territory." "Will it?" Yuna asked. "No," Thresk said, "because surrender would mean death for everyone who depends on my organization. But I am also not willing to sacrifice my daughter for my empire." He turned his compound eyes fully toward Yuna, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical pressure. "This is where you become useful," Thresk continued, "because the Cathari compound is heavily guarded, and any assault by my forces would result in Vela's death. But a single human infiltrator would never be suspected." "Why not?" Yuna asked. "Because humans are considered harmless by most species in this sector," Thresk said, "and the Cathari would assume any human wandering near their compound was simply lost or confused. Not a threat." Yuna thought about the Cathari, a species she had studied during her military training, because they were known throughout the galaxy as some of the most dangerous warriors in existence. They stood over 2 meters tall with 4 arms and a physiology that pumped combat chemicals through their bodies during fights, sending them into berserker rages that made them nearly impossible to stop. "The payment would be 400,000 credits, Thresk said, "plus the release of your colleague Sorix, plus transport off this station to any destination you choose." "And if I refuse?" Yuna asked. Then you will pay your fine with your arena winnings and leave this station. Thresk said, but your colleague will remain here as my guest until I find someone else willing to attempt this mission. Sorks was not a fighter and he would not survive long as a hostage of someone like Thresk. I want Sorks released first. Una said, and then I want half the payment up front and the other half when I return with your daughter. Thresk's mandibles spread in what she now recognized as a Morvath smile. You have courage, he said, and I accept your terms with one modification. Your colleague will be released, but he will remain on the station until you return, because I need some guarantee of your loyalty. It was not ideal, but it was better than nothing. Tell me about the compound. Una said. Thresk activated a new holographic display showing a three-dimensional map of a converted mining facility on the station's outer ring. The Cathari have fortified this structure with approximately 40 warriors. Thresk explained, and my daughter is being held in a detention cell on the 3rd level, and the security systems are designed to detect energy weapons and explosives, but not a person. Una said, the maintenance corridors are unmonitored because the Cathari consider them beneath their notice. Thresk confirmed, and a skilled infiltrator could potentially reach the 3rd level without being detected. Una studied the map and began planning routes and fallback positions and escape options. 3 hours later, she was in a small room with Sorks, who had been released from whatever cell Thresk had been keeping him in. This is suicide, Sorks said, his head froze rigid with distress. And 40 Cathari warriors is an army. And you cannot fight an army by yourself. I do not plan to fight them, Una said, and I plan to avoid them entirely. And what happens when avoiding them becomes impossible? Sorks demanded. Una did not have a good answer for that. Tell me about the Cathari, she said instead, and tell me everything you know about how they think and fight. Sorks was a translator by profession, which meant he had studied dozens of species and their cultures, and he spent the next hour sharing everything he knew about the Cathari. They were a warrior species that valued strength above all else, and their entire society was built around combat and conquest. They fought to kill rather than to subdue because in their culture, allowing a defeated enemy to live was considered an insult to that enemy's honor. They could not comprehend surrender or mercy because those concepts simply did not exist in their worldview. There is one more thing, Sorks said as Una prepared to leave, and I learned this from intercepted communications that Thresk shared with me. What is it? Una asked. The Cathari compound contains something besides your target, Sorks said, and they have apparently discovered some kind of ancient technology during their mining operations. Something called a precursor communication array. Una knew about the precursors from her military briefings. An ancient species that had disappeared millions of years ago, but left behind technology so advanced that modern civilizations could barely understand it. A communication array, she said, capable of broadcasting across the entire galaxy instantaneously. Sorks confirmed, and the Cathari are planning to auction it to the highest bidder, which could include hostile powers that would use such technology to coordinate attacks across vast distances. This changed things. Rescuing Thresk's daughter was one thing, but allowing technology that dangerous to fall into the wrong hands was something Una could not ignore. Does Thresk know about this? She asked. He knows, Sorks said, and he does not care because his only concern is his daughter. Una checked her equipment one final time and headed for the door. If I do not return, she told Sorks, find a way to contact the Alliance and tell them about the precursor technology. And if you do return, Sorks asked Una, allowed herself a small smile. Then I will tell them myself, she said. She slipped into the station's maintenance corridors and began making her way toward the outer ring where the Cathari compound waited, like a trap ready to spring. The station, called Nexus 7, floated in the darkness between 3 star systems and belonged to no government or alliance or empire. which made it the perfect place for criminals and refugees and desperate people of all species to gather and trade. And fight and die. Sergeant Una Park stood in the customs office and tried very hard not to punch the Velthury official who was explaining why her shuttle had been impounded. The cargo manifest lists 17 containers of medical supplies, the official said, his silver scales catching the harsh overhead lights. But our scanners detected 19 containers, which means you have undeclared goods, and that means a fine of 40,000 galactic credits. Those 2 extra containers hold emergency rations, Una said, keeping her voice calm even though her hands wanted to form fists. And they were added at the last station because we had room and people here might need food. Undeclared is undeclared. The official replied with something that might have been a smile on his narrow face. And you have 72 hours to pay the fine, or you and your colleague will be transferred to the detention facility on the lower ring. Una had heard stories about that detention facility, and none of them ended with people walking out alive. She left the customs office and found Sarx waiting for her in the corridor outside, his translator implant flickering blue as it processed a dozen languages being spoken by passers-by. Sarx was Velthury like the customs official, but younger and more idealistic, and he had volunteered to accompany Una on this diplomatic supply run because he believed in building bridges between species. How bad is it? He asked, though his drooping head frills suggested he already knew the answer. 40,000 credits in 3 days, or we disappear into a hole, Una said, and I have exactly 200 credits to my name. They walked through the station's market district while Una tried to think of options. But every idea she considered hit the same wall of impossible numbers. She could contact the Alliance for help, but communications to the nearest relay would take 4 days minimum. She could try to escape the station, but her shuttle was locked down, and stealing another ship would make them fugitives across 3 sectors. She could try to negotiate with the customs official, but the Velthury had made it clear that the fine was not actually about containers or manifests, but about someone wanting a human military officer to vanish quietly. There is one possibility, Sorix said as they passed a crowded drinking establishment filled with species Una did not recognize, but I do not think you will like it. He pointed toward a massive structure at the center of the market district, a dome of dark metal covered in holographic advertisements showing fighters of various species locked in combat. The Kalvath Crucible, Sorix explained, is the station's arena where disputes and debts and personal grudges are settled through sanctioned fighting, and the winners receive substantial prize money. How substantial? Una asked. First-tier victories pay 5,000 credits, Sorix said, and championship matches can pay 50,000 or more. Una did the math in her head and did not like the answer, but she liked the detention facility even less. What are the rules? She asked. Minimal, Sorix admitted, and deaths are not uncommon. Which is why I said you would not like this option, because humans are not known for combat prowess among galactic species. Una almost laughed at that, but stopped herself because she did not want to explain the long and bloody history of human warfare to someone who thought her species was fragile. Show me where to register, she said. The registration office for the Crucible was a small room staffed by a Morvith, a species that resembled tall insects with too many limbs and compound eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once. A human, the Morvith said when Una approached the counter. And he wished to fight, not to bet on the fighting. That is correct, Una said. Interesting, the Morvith replied, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. And we do have an opening in tonight's schedule because the originally planned fighter suffered an unfortunate accident this morning. Who would I be fighting? Una asked. His name is Garth, the Morvith said, and a holographic image appeared above the counter showing a massive reptilian creature covered in dark green scales that looked thick enough to stop bullets. And he is Dreketh, and he has won 37 consecutive matches in this arena, and he has requested a new opponent because he finds the regular fighters boring. Sorix made a sound of distress beside her, but Yuna kept her expression neutral. I accept. She said, Wonderful, the Morvith replied. And now you must select your weapons from our armory, which includes blades and clubs and projectile weapons and energy weapons and chemical weapons, and I will fight barehanded. Yuna interrupted. The Morvith's compound eyes all focused on her at once. I must inform you that no one has ever defeated a Drekith without weapons, the registration official said, and I must also inform you that our bookkeepers have just set your survival odds at 12 to 1 against. Understood, Yuna said, and I will still fight barehanded. The hours before the match passed slowly, and Yuna spent them stretching and meditating and remembering every lesson she had learned in military combatives training, and before that in the martial arts. Schools her grandmother had insisted she attend as a child. Sorix tried several times to convince her to withdraw, but Yuna refused because withdrawal meant the detention facility, and the detention facility meant death. When the time came, she walked through the tunnel that led to the arena floor and emerged into blinding lights and the roar of thousands of voices belonging to dozens of species. The arena was a circular platform, surrounded by shimmering energy barriers, and above the barriers rose tier after tier of seating filled with creatures that had traveled from across the galaxy to watch violence. Yuna wore simple fighting clothes with no armor and no weapons, and the crowd responded to her appearance with laughter that needed no translation. Gareth entered from the opposite tunnel, and he was even larger in person than he had appeared in the hologram, standing nearly 3 meters tall with claws like curved knives and a tail that could probably crush stone. Human, Gorath called out in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. I was hoping for a challenge tonight, but instead they send me a snack. The crowd laughed again. Do you want to pray to your gods before we begin? Gorath asked, because I am told humans have many gods, and perhaps one of them will grant you a quick death. Yuna said nothing. She rolled her shoulders and shifted her weight and felt the familiar calm that always came to her before combat. The quiet place inside where fear could not reach. The arena master's voice echoed from speakers, hidden somewhere above. Fighters ready, the voice announced, and the match begins now. Gorath charged. Yuna moved. Gorath was fast for his size, but Yuna was faster, and she slipped to the left as his massive body thundered past her, his claws slicing through empty air where her head had been a moment before. The crowd went silent for just a heartbeat, and then exploded into surprise shouting. Gorath spun around with more grace than Yuna had expected from something so large, and his tail swept toward her legs in a strike that would have shattered bone if it connected. She jumped over it and landed in a crouch, and already Gorath was lunging at her again with both clawed hands reaching for her throat. Yuna ducked under his grasp and drove her fist into the soft tissue beneath his arm where the scales were thinner, and Gorath made a sound of surprise. That was almost funny coming from such a terrifying creature. You are quicker than I thought, Nilrith admitted as he circled her with new caution in his yellow eyes. But speed will not save you, little human, because I can do this all night, and you will tire long before I do. He was wrong about that, but Yuna did not waste breath explaining why humans were persistence predators who had evolved to chase prey across vast distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and while Gorath was certainly stronger and more heavily armored than she was, Yuna knew something he did not know. She could keep going long after other species would have given up. Gorath attacked again, and this time he was more careful, and his claws caught her across the shoulder and left 3 lines of fire that immediately began bleeding. The crowd cheered because they had come to see blood, and now they were seeing it. Yuna ignored the pain, because pain was just information, and the information was telling her that she was still alive and still fighting. She moved inside Gorath's reach where his long arms became a disadvantage, and she struck him 3 times in rapid succession. Once in the throat and once in the nerve cluster beneath his jaw, and once in the sensitive spot behind his ear that she had noticed when studying his hologram. Gareth staggered backward with his hands clutching his head, and the crowd noise shifted to something that sounded like disbelief. "What are you?" Gareth demanded, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his voice. Una still did not answer, because talking used energy, and she needed all of her energy for the fight. She pressed her advantage and attacked again, targeting every gap in his scales, and every vulnerable point she could reach. Gareth recovered and caught her with a backhand blow that sent her flying across the arena floor, and she hit the energy barrier hard enough to see stars exploding behind her eyes. The crowd roared its approval, because surely the human was finished now. Surely she would stay down and accept defeat or death or whatever ending Gareth chose to give her. Una got up. Blood ran down her face from a cut somewhere above her hairline, and her shoulder screamed with every movement, and something in her ribs felt wrong, but she got up anyway. She got up because getting up was what humans did. Gareth stared at her with his yellow eyes wide. "Stay down," he said, and there was something almost like pleading in his rumbling voice. "Stay down, little human, because I do not want to kill something that fights this hard. Then you should surrender." Una replied, and she raised her fists again, the Vion and Dijon. Fight continued for 10 more minutes, and then 10 more after that. And somewhere in the crowd, a Veltari spectator was frantically searching through archived exploration files, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The files talked about something called persistence predation, a hunting strategy where a species simply refused to stop chasing until its prey was too exhausted to run anymore. The files talked about human endurance and human pain tolerance, and something called the second wind, where humans who should have collapsed somehow found new reserves of energy. The files talked about wars on the human homeworld that lasted for years, and soldiers who kept fighting with wounds that would have killed members of other species. The spectator shared these files with those sitting nearby, and the information spread through the crowd like fire. On the arena floor, Gareth was slowing down. His attacks were becoming sloppy, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, and he could not understand how the tiny human was still standing when he had hit her hard enough to kill a Morvith 3 times over. Una saw her opportunity. She moved inside his reach one more time, and this time she did not strike him, but instead wrapped herself around him like a snake coiling around prey. Her arms went around his neck and her legs locked around his torso, and she began to squeeze. Gareth thrashed and clawed at her, but she had positioned herself where he could not reach, and his scales could not help him against an attack that was not trying to cut or pierce, but simply to constrict. He tried to slam her against the arena floor, but she held on. He tried to crush her against the energy barrier, but she held on. He tried to peel her off with his claws, but she buried her face against his neck and held on. The technique was called a rear naked choke, and it had been developed by human fighters centuries ago, specifically to defeat larger and stronger opponents by cutting off blood flow to the brain. Gareth's movements became weaker and weaker, and then he fell to his knees, and then he fell forward onto the arena floor with Una still attached to his back. She held the choke for another 10 seconds to make sure, and then she released him and rolled away and stood up on legs that were shaking but refused to collapse. The arena was completely silent. 10,000 beings from dozens of species stared at the impossible scene before them. A human woman barely taller than Gareth's chest standing victorious over the arena's undefeated champion. Then the silence broke, and the noise was like nothing Una had ever heard. A wall of sound that seemed to shake the entire station. Medics rushed onto the arena floor to revive Gareth, who was unconscious but breathing, and Una stood alone in the center of the chaos and tried to remember how to breathe. A Morvith approached her through the crowd of medics and officials, and Una recognized him as someone important by the quality of his clothing and the deference other beings showed him. That was extraordinary. The Morvis said, "And I represent someone who wishes to hire you for a very specific job. I just want my prize money," Una said, "so I can pay my fine and leave this station. The prize money is yours regardless." The Morvith replied, "But the person I represent is prepared to offer you 10 times that amount for one night of work. And if I refuse?" Una asked. The Morvith's mandibles clicked in a way that was definitely not amusement. "The person I represent owns the customs official who impounded your shuttle," he said, "and refusal is not really an option." Una looked across the arena to where Sorix was watching from the stands, with his head frills flattened in worry. She had won the fight, but she had a feeling her troubles were just beginning.